Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are designating our reading of each of the poems of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of Myself, passage 38, the conclusion of this section that we've been looking at of section 26 to 38, the poet's microscopic vision from the ordinary to the mystical. Now, at this moment, we start to get this feeling that we're into the back end of Song of Myself, and we'll feel like we're heading into the final third. This poem is in many ways kind of that pivotal moment. Some have said that passage 38 is the most remarkable single passage in all of Song of Myself. I've had colleagues and students who have said it's the most remarkable passage in all of Leaves of Grass. I think the more we study Leaves of Grass, like any great work of literature, the more we're blown away by the things that Whitman is trying to pull off. And we're going to begin to hear increasingly now from passage 38 on to the end of 52, increasingly more and more Whitman's teacher's voice. Teacher, pedagogue, Whitman as pedagogue. Go back to our very earlier lectures as we're talking about that. Remember that we said that passage 4 provides us with that key line, both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. I witness and wait. And there's been a lot of witnessing that's been going on now in this smaller section of 26 to 38, culminating with the words enough, enough, enough 3 times. We'll get to it in a moment. Now, my assumption is that you've been working with us at LearnStrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, the 24 poems of inscription. In fact, I'm going to reference the very first of those poems because I'm thoroughly convinced that Whitman in the deathbed edition understood exactly what he was doing. By the way, we're going to have quite a bit of editing from the 1855 original version of this poem, and we're going to ask if you feel like it's a stronger or weaker offering for the editing. Starting from Palmanac, passage 1 through 19, and then obviously we're hoping that you've been with us for the Song of Myself, passages 1 through 37, and more importantly, that intro set of comments at the beginning of our discussion of Song of Myself. Now, passages 36 and 37, you'll remember some disturbing and painful kinds of stuff, which will culminate then with this, the triple, enough, enough, enough. And we're going to get into the way in which Whitman, I think, is trying to bring together the death narratives of Socrates and Christ, and we'll have more to say about that in a bit. But let's just put this in our notes now. It is clear that this is Whitman's theodicy, that is to say, of our big 5. Epistemology, what you can know; ontology, who you are; psychology, what you fear and what your motivations are; sociology, what the group fears and what the group's motivations are. Our last, the big 5, is theodicy. Why does bad stuff have to happen? And how do you address the pain and suffering of the world? Well, we have said that Whitman's theodicy, when bad things happen, is to challenge us to no longer ask, why did this happen to me, but rather, why did this happen for me? The capacity to do that is fundamental, I believe, to reading Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and certainly we're going to see that played out here. Now, Whitman had a very interesting observation that runs something like this. He said it this way: I have no patience with people who start out to blacken the face of the earth. Whether it's constitutional or not with me, he said, I stand for the sunny point of view, stand for the joyful conclusions. And then he finished this little note in his notebooks with the word cheer. Now, I think we're going to see some of that. Clearly, it's obvious. Whitman's been dealing with some pretty disturbing kind of images. But now, passage 38. Enough, enough, enough. Somehow I've been stunned. Stand back. Give me a little time beyond my cuffed head. Slumbers, dreams, gaping. I discover myself on the verge of a usual mistake, that I could forget the mockers and insults, that I could forget the trickling tears and the blows of the bludgeons and hammers, that I could look with a separate look on my own crucifixion and bloody crowning. I remember now. I resume the overstayed fraction. The grave of rock multiplies what has been confided to it, or to any graves. Corpses rise, gashes heal, fastenings roll from me. I troop forth replenished with supreme power, one of an average, unending procession. Inland and seacoast we go, and pass all boundary lines, our swift ordinances on their way over the whole earth, the blossoms we wear in our hats, the growth of thousands of years. Eleves, I salute you. Come forward. Continue your annotations. Continue your questionings. Now, this élèves is French for students, and so already we're beginning to invest some time in Whitman's pedagogy. But I'm not actually going to start there. I'm going to start actually with Socrates and Christ, and of course those death narratives. Think about this. We have in Plato's Phaedo, of course we've lectured it at learnstrong.net, we have in Plato's Phaedo those final moments with Socrates before he drinks his hemlock shake in 399 BCE. And of course, we will have several moments in the Gospels of the last words of Christ. You'll remember, though, that in John 19:30, Christ will say from the cross, in that rendering, it is finished. Those are the last words according to the Gospel account of John. I think that's important to read now, the opening lines of enough, enough, enough. By the way, just pay attention to all of these exclamation points. Do you see them all? You got 7 of them in this, starting out with 4 of them. Notice, enough, exclamation point, enough, exclamation point, enough, exclamation point. But what's interesting is that this is not actually the way the 55 version opened this poem. Notice, now remember, the last line of 37 was, askers embody themselves in me, and I am embodied in them. I project my hat and sit shamefaced and beg. Remember, in the 55 version, there is no numbering like what you're looking at in your edition of Deathbed Edition. And the next lines are, I rise ecstatic through all, and sweep with the true gravitation. The whirling and whirling is elemental within me. I mean, we immediately think of Yeats's Second Coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre, right? That spinning kind of idea, this whirling and whirling. Interestingly, that's not how he decides to finish the deathbed edition of this poem. Instead, it's enough, enough, enough. Somehow he says, I've been stunned. That is to say, all of the pain, all the suffering of the world. Stand back. I told you the word stand's important in our reading of Leaves of Grass. Stand back. Give me a little time. Think about the ways in which time has been central to our reading of Leaves of Grass. Beyond my cuffed head, that is to say, broken down, slumbers, we think about Thoreau's Walden, we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, right? Dreams, gaping. And then he says that I discover myself, which is a fascinating line, given that the name of this poem is Song of Myself. I discover myself on the verge of a usual mistake. Now, Whitman was raised by a really darkly pessimistic father. If you study the biography, for good reason. I mean, his daddy had some serious problems economically, socioeconomically. But Whitman decides to come out of all of that in the same way that he will leave passages 36, 37 and to step out of it, and he says, I almost made the mistake. What mistake? That I could forget. Remember, Whitman's view is the only sin is to forget. That I could forget the mockers and insults. Now, this will be a significant line through the course of Leaves of Grass over the years, right? Because Whitman himself had to live with a lot of mockers and insults. That I could forget the trickling tears and the blows of the bludgeons. You'll remember that those poor young men in passage 34 getting bludgeoned with the end of rifles, and hammers. Right? Now, of course, the minute we think about hammers, if you're playing around with the idea of the deathbed or the last moments of Christ, hammers and crucifixion, or getting ready for that word picture. That I could, notice it's the third for the anaphora here, that I could look, again, I witness and wait, with a separate look on my own crucifixion and bloody crowning. Now, there were people who were deeply insulted and offended by this line. In other words, who does he think he is? He thinks he's somehow subsumed Jesus Christ himself on the cross? Of course, it sounds blasphemous at first glance, but when you understand what Whitman is doing here with his democratic voice, he is saying somehow all of us have to go through our own crucifixion. It's fascinating that, of course, it will be Arthur Miller in his great play, right, The Crucible, where John Proctor will in fact say to his wife at the very end, enough. enough, as she, of course, begins to say, I am at fault. It's quite a remarkable thing what Miller pulls off. I think he's borrowing from Whitman in that moment. Notice he says, I remember now. Now, we're moving towards the end of Song of Myself with lines like this. And by the way, the word now was not included in the 55 edition, but I remember now. I resume, that is to say, I'm ready to pick it back up. The overstayed fraction. The grave of rock. It's an amazing reference here to the burial of Christ. The grave of rock multiplies what has been confided to it, or to any graves. Takes us back, of course, to passage 6, to die is luckier than what one had assumed, right? He says, corpses rise. Think about Matthew 27:52 and the idea that after Christ's death, the saints rise from the graves. Corpses rise. Gashes heal. We're going to get replenished here in the next line. Fastenings roll, and then in the original 55 version it was away. Here it's roll from me. In other words, there isn't any way to keep me down. There isn't anything that's going to disturb our cheerful faith, right, that Wordsworth will play with. And we obviously love to see these connections between Whitman and Wordsworth. I troop forth. It is amazing all the different verbs that Whitman can invent to simply use to talk about walking, right? Here it's troop. In other words, we're constantly going to be messing around with two word pictures. Going out onto the ocean, we think of Odysseus, and of course taking these long walks. And obviously we think about any number of great walkers. We think of Thoreau and Emerson's comments about Thoreau and the way he walked. Go back to our lectures at Learn Strong on both Emerson and Thoreau for that one. I troop forth, replenish, notice earlier was heal, with supreme power. And the moment that you see this word power, you cannot help but go all the way back to the very, very first poem that you read in your deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. I told you guys I was going to try and fight most of this, but for some of this, I can't leave it without this. Of life immense, last stanza, oneself I sing. Very first poem, right after the introductory epigraph. Life of life immense, impassioned, pulse and power, cheerful. For freest action formed under the laws divine, the modern man I sing. Very first poem, and notice that the word power gets used. Here we are. He loves these echoings that come back, right? Power. It's like, wow, where did I hear that word before? There it is, right? Now back to it, just to finish. I troop forth replenished with supreme power, one of an average, unending procession. By the way, the word average here for Whitman is not a derogatory, pejorative term. Average here means democratic. Everybody, in other words, everybody gets to deal with this. Now, interestingly, there is a line that then is edited out from the 55 version that runs like this. We walk the roads of Ohio and Massachusetts and Virginia and Wisconsin and New York and New Orleans and Texas and Montreal and San Francisco and Charleston and Savannah and Mexico. No kidding. He just decided to get rid of all of that. You get to decide. Again, I'm just pointing out to you the way that the editing happens. You get to decide whether you think, why would he do that? Why would he get rid of all of that, right? Inland and seacoast, those are his two word pictures for the rest of Song of Myself. You're either walking on the land or you're swimming. Now, all of these lines in 38 will come to fruition in 46. So put that in your notes. It's huge. We're going to get to 46 and we're going to say the heart of Song of Myself is passage 46 in the first line of 47. I think it's something I'm going to try and argue anyway. We'll see. Inland and seacoast we go. Notice it's we. Pass all boundary lines. Again, transcend and include. It's an evolutionary view. In other words, nothing can hold us back. The optimism is obviously palpable here. Our swift ordinances on their way. He loves the word swift, doesn't he? Over the whole earth. He loves the word whole when he references the earth. By the way, we're going to see this with passage to India, so put that in 3a. The blossoms we wear in our hats. This is wonderful given that the poems are all called Leaves of Grass. The blossoms we wear in our hats, and this is amazing. Think about it. In passage 20, we heard about hats as it relates to, I'll wear it any way I want. In passage 37, we heard about hats, only now it's a beggar begging for some small amount of sustenance. And then here he comes back to hats. The blossoms we wear in our hats, the growth of thousands of years. Now, in the original 55 version, it was 2,000 years, so that he could drive home the point he was making, I believe, with Jesus Christ and the crucifixion of it is finished, or enough, enough, enough. But then he changes it to thousands, which allows us to do what? Read both Christ as well as Socrates. In other words, Both Christ and Socrates are great what? Well, look at the next word, right? Élèves. Now, he uses the French word, right, for students or pupils. And I don't know, maybe he is referencing the 1848 French Revolution that was stood up, of course, to all the challenges of its day. Here, though, the invention of this student. Now, we've seen this already. I say invention. We've seen it already. But it will be here that Whitman begins to assume this teacher's voice. I want you to pay attention to it. Notice what he says to the élèves. He says, first of all, I salute you. Right? In other words, I welcome you. I challenge you. It's almost as if he's saying to anyone reading along with us in our talks with Walt, hey, I can't believe you've made it this far. High five. Good job. And then he says it. Come forward. In other words, don't stop. This will, of course, remind us of our passage 24 from Dante's Inferno, when Dante the Pilgrim is so tired, and it is the Virgilian voice. It is that teacher's voice. Go back to our lectures on this. Up on your feet. This is no time to tire. The man who lies asleep will never waken fame in his desire, and all his life slipped past him like a dream. It's fascinating that Whitman would even use the word dream in this poem. Right? So here it is, right? Élèves, I salute you. Come forward. Continue, it's almost as if he's speaking directly to us, right? Continue your annotations. There it is, right? So, obviously, what game are we playing as we're playing our talks with Walt? What we're annotating. What does that mean? Well, look at it. We're reading so that we can understand, so that we can continue our what? Questions. It is fascinating that in the deathbed edition, the last word of this poem is questions. By the way, this is not how the poem ends in the 55 edition. Rather, it reads like this. Élèves, I salute you. I see the approach of your numberless gangs. I see you understand yourselves and me, and know that they who have eyes are divine, and the blind and lame are equally divine, and that my steps drag behind yours, yet go before them, and are aware how I am with you no more than I am with everybody. Now, there are some who say they love those lines so much they cannot believe that he edited those lines out. Instead, he went with continue your annotations and continue your questionings. Of course, think about the power of the word questionings as it relates to, passage number 6. The child's asking, what is the grass? We're going to see this most profoundly in passage 46 when he says, I hear you're asking me questions. I answer, I cannot answer. You must find out for yourself. Don't worry, we will get to that. I think he's setting us up for that. But I want to take us really quickly to passage 2. I told you there's echoes going all the way back. Do you remember these lines at the end of Song of Myself 2? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on the spectered books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides. You'll remember in our lecture, he said this is fundamentally what it means to be a student. You shall listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. Right? Here we're getting some exhortation to continue to do the same. Let's quickly finish our annotations right at 2a. Well, obviously, we got to look not past our pain and suffering, but what? Through our pain and suffering is the point here, right? We can't forget about, along with the suffering, we've got to enjoy at the park, swing at the park, because the van's always waiting. You ain't met no 200-year-old people. We got to make sure that we enjoy the experience of swinging at the park. At 2b, the allusions to the final days of Christ and Socrates, I think, are profound. The use of the French word, right, élève, I think is fascinating. The edited lines I'll leave to you. At 3a, I think Thoreau's Walden comes to mind here. If you've built castles in the air, that's where they belong. Now put the foundations under them. Finally, at 3b, why do you think, for you to own this poem, why do you think it is so hard to see through the pain and suffering, to learn to ask, why did this happen for me instead of to me? Right? To finally see and experience the joy. And when was a time that you actually did that? Now, we're ready for the last 14 sections, and the teacher's voice will become paramount here. But I'm interested in the next 3, 39, 40, 41, and the poet as understood as divine. Let's enjoy ourselves and go there. I hope this is challenging you to more questions. Thank you.